clip should not be, most likely to be the weirdest thing in the world.
Yeah.
Right? It should be like, I want to say something that is so close to like hurting your feelings that they're like stereotypes almost, because there's that level of truth in what somebody's saying about you that like you can't deny it. Like I've had a hole in my life, but really it's a lack of sound because Apple's not there to talk so damn much. Right? Like that's what senior superlative night ought to be.
You can count on Alan here in the bow tie.
Roast people.
I can tell. Sounds good.
He will come up with something fast, and it'll never be over. All right, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started because we know that you guys have class starting at 1. Some of you do. Unfortunately, Fatty's Pizza is late, apparently as usual. But what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and get started, and then when it does arrive, we will pass the pizzas down the aisles so that you guys can still eat, and we can still go ahead and hear Mr. Petersen speak. This is Austin Petersen. He's a former Libertarian presidential candidate, and we are super excited to have him today to speak on the principles of the Libertarian movement. And just everybody give him a warm welcome from Mercer Law.
Hey everybody, how y'all doing? Nice to see you all. Pretty friendly looking crowd. I guess this is the troublemaker over here, right? Well, yeah, so as she said, I was a candidate for President of the United States in 2016. And as you can tell from how I look, I think I just barely made the cutoff line for being old enough to run. But it's kind of like, when you turn 18 years old, you buy a lottery ticket. You turn 21, you buy a beer. You turn 35, you run for president, right? That's how it works. But truly the deeper reason why I ran for president was because in fall of 2015, I had been supporting Senator Rand Paul in his run for President of the United States. I saw him as the person who most closely embodied the belief system that I share. And that is because having been in politics for about 10 years now, I had started my political career as a volunteer for Congressman Ron Paul, who was a great inspiration to me. And so in 2015 in fall, I was watching the presidential debates, and as we all know, history is what it is. Donald Trump was just cleaning his clock. And perhaps a bit pretentious of me to consider that I could run for president of the United States, but I thought that because of my political experience, my background is actually in theater performance. And before you laugh, Ronald Reagan was an actor, right? Probably the greatest president since Calvin Coolidge, in my opinion. Although the anarcho-capitalists that I'm going to talk about today as well, they probably disagree. Not fans of Reagan, but I was. And I decided to run for president because I didn't see anyone who was going to make it through the Republican primary who represented my beliefs, my controversial beliefs as a pro-life libertarian, someone who is pro-constitution, and very much pro-liberty, individual liberty. So I started running, even though Rand hadn't dropped out yet, because I saw the writing on the wall and thought to myself, well, I'd better get a campaign going right now, because if Rand drops out, if Ted Cruz drops out, constitutionalists, conservatives, limited government types are going to be looking for a champion of their ideas. And while we may have some fans of Donald Trump, I know he did well here in Georgia, we have to understand, and I'm going to talk about political ideologies here in just a moment, that Donald Trump represents populism in a broad sense. And if we don't know what populism is, populism in the broad sense, really what that means is that the idea is sort of, not might makes right, that's democracy, but populism is a belief in the wisdom of the crowds. Right? Frequently you'll see Donald Trump come out with a position, for example, like he did on abortion, and he would say, yeah, we're going to prosecute the mothers, and then huge backlash, and then the next day he's like, oops, I meant prosecute the doctors, right? So he's doing what we in my business right now that I run as an advertising business, we call this A/B testing, right? So he was applying A/B testing to politics, which isn't frequently done. A/B testing, if you don't know what it is, A/B testing is like if you run an advertisement, you see how well it performs, then you replace it, put in another advertisement, and if that performs better, then that's the advertisement that you run. Well, he does that with policy, right? With public polling, in a sense. So a populist would say, okay, well, what's the most popular position that I can take right now? And in that sense, that's very much what he campaigned on. Whereas I'm not a rigid ideologue, but I do have an ideology. And while that ideology I would call broadly libertarianism, there are many different schools of libertarianism, which I've identified around 11 different schools that I'd like to discuss with you all very briefly today. But before I do, just a quick little career refresher for you all. So in 2007, I started campaigning for Ron Paul as a volunteer. We turned a 12-person activist group in downtown New York City into a 1,200-person strong activist group, and we raised $1 million for Ron Paul. That gets you noticed, so I got a job in Washington, D.C., worked for the Libertarian National Committee for a year, worked my way up pretty fast there, and after that I moved on to an international think tank. It's not very well known. Some of you might be familiar with the Cato Institute. Well, the Cato Institute they're the domestic policy institute, but they have an international branch called the Atlas Foundation. And what the Atlas Foundation does is it teaches libertarians around the world how to spread dissent and anarchy in their own countries. But not really. Basically what my job was to teach libertarians and conservatives overseas how to use social media and technology to advance libertarian principles in their countries. And we've had great success. Atlas successfully fomented a strong libertarian movement in Brazil. And we also have stations in China, Russia, and in Malaysia as well. So I worked with international libertarians at that point. Now, behind the scenes, I was privately working on a project at the time, this would have been 2009, to get Judge Andrew Napolitano at Fox, if any of you are familiar with him, Judge Napolitano, his own show on Fox. And that was a successful effort. I was able to become a television producer for a couple of years. So I went from my original career, which I was working in television and news and media and theater production, to doing political activism, to then going from DC back to New York and working in television for a couple of years. And I've got some pretty fantastic stories about that, and I'll share that with you, those stories more tonight as I get into that discussion. So I hope you'll join us tonight. Today I'm going to try and focus a little bit more on strict ideology because I'm told that you guys are the brainiacs and the smart kids here today. So before we open up to the general public, we'll talk about the brainy subjects here with the brainiacs. So and the fatties, I guess. But anyway, are we not the fatties? I guess the pizza place is called Fatties. Okay, I thought this was like we're fatties or something. Okay, good. All right, good. Yeah, I did gain a lot of weight, and that's what'll happen to you on the campaign trail. It's funny too because I actually had brown hair, mostly brown hair, and a lot more of it before I started campaigning for president. So, if you want to have good health, don't ever run for president. It'll kill you. It will. All right. So most of you might be familiar with the general principles of libertarianism. The general principles of libertarianism, maximum individual liberty, minimum government. But one of the reasons that the Libertarian Party and libertarianism, I think, struggles is because of the multitude of factions that exist within libertarianism, which divides us amongst one another. That exists in the broader democratic movement, the social democratic movement. That exists in the broader conservative movement. But there are far fewer factions, and they are far more willing to work with one another because they don't have to fight over who's a statist. They're all like, yeah, we're all statists. But with libertarians, if you're not a member of one of these factions, if you're a member of an opposing faction, well, then you're not a true libertarian. And so this is probably the main struggle that we as limited government types fight with, because we, rather than sort of taking the fight to the statists, we tend to have a circular firing squad. I guess we were talking about that earlier today. And that happened in the presidential campaign. It was me versus, Gary Bake the Cake Johnson, and, John might have killed a guy in Belize McAfee, right? So, but no, I love John. Gary, yeah, but But it was still a terrific learning experience, although there was quite a bit of infighting. And you know, I picked enough fights for myself, right? That's what you have to do when you're an underdog, right? Nobody knew who the hell I was. So yeah, let's talk about these 11 different schools. I'm just going to go through them briefly, try and throw out some examples of famous people who might believe this school of libertarian thought. And then afterwards, we can have just a nice casual chat and we can get fat. All right. So the first school, probably the most famous school of libertarianism, or at least the one that's the most controversial, the one that is like the sexiest school of libertarianism, school of thought, is anarcho-capitalism, which is a school of anarchy. Now, there are lots of different types of anarchy, but the two major schools of anarchy that exist in the United States lie on sort of separate ends of the spectrum. One is anarcho-capitalism and the other one is anarcho-communism. Communists quite frequently call themselves anarchists simply because they would believe that once they abolish the state completely that they will have a classless society and that classless society will be governed democratically. Anarcho-capitalists say once we abolish the state we replace it with nothing, no democracy, don't tell me what to do, and it's my life and I can do with it as I please. They basically believe that governments monopolize services that would be better left to corporations. So if you guys know Ron Swanson, right, rather than a park where you can go to for free, you drop in a token like Chuck E. Cheese, you go for a walk, right? Drop in another token, look at a duck. So, essentially anarcho-capitalism would fully privatize public services, things like police, fire, courts, military. In some of those things, I actually agree with them. I think that some of these things can be privatized. In fact, quite a few of these public services, quote unquote, are privatized. People like to laugh at anarcho-capitalists, and I'm not one, but they do poke fun at anarcho-capitalists saying, oh, private police, ha ha ha. Well, what are you going to do? You're going to have to pay the officer $10,000 to have him show up and protect you? Well, no, first of all, we think that that's what the Second Amendment is for, but when it comes to privatizing police services, there's private security everywhere. There's probably private security on this campus. Corporations hire private security. I worked at Fox News. They had private security. So that's essentially private police. Now, they don't have the authority to put you in jail. They might have the authority to put you in a lockup for a short time. But anarcho-capitalists do believe in abolishing these public services entirely, including fire departments. And again, even though I'm not an anarchist, I do like to play devil's advocate sometimes for them and say that fire services were mostly privatized until the turn of the 20th century. We had private fire departments. Actually, how it worked was it was fire insurance. You paid fire insurance, and everybody in the community paid collectively into a fire insurance pool. And unfortunately, there were times, however, when a fire would start, and if someone hadn't paid into the fire insurance pool, then they would be charged, right? If their house was on fire, the fire company at the time, which was a true company, would require them to pay a fee. So some famous, the centerpiece of anarcho-capitalist philosophy, and some libertarians would argue minarchist philosophy, is the most controversial, to me, the controversial philosophy, which is a difficult subject because this is where I become a heretic to libertarians. But it's the foundational principle of anarcho-capitalism, which is called the non-aggression principle. We call it the NAP. And people are like, Austin, why do you hate NAPs? And I'm like, no, I love NAPs, but I sort of don't like the NAP. But I want to make sure that I represent it to you as objectively as possible. The non-aggression principle, which again libertarians believe is foundational, is the concept essentially of do no harm. That it's sort of like the golden rule, basically that you don't have the right to initiate force against someone unless force has been initiated against you. And that is it is the foundational principle of the Libertarian Party in many ways. The Libertarian Party actually requires you to join to sign a pledge that you support the foundational principle, which is the non-aggression principle. Fundamentally, and this is just my opinion, and very few libertarians agree with me, I have to admit, foundationally I believe that the problems of the non-aggression principle lie in the problems of pollution. Right? So if you never have the right to initiate force or to harm someone else's private property, if you drive a car or you drive a truck or even if you take public transportation, if that pollutes, essentially you're violating someone else's property rights, right? Just like if you're smoking and you blow secondhand smoke in their face. One of the most extreme examples would have been what Murray Rothbard, who was probably the modern brilliant mind who founded the anarcho-capitalist school, was that if you consider the initiation of force to be the only evil, which government, of course, is an initiation of force in some sense, right? You are imposing your will on others. Then what about the concept of neglect? Now, this is sort of why I parted ways with anarcho-capitalists and considered myself what I'll describe later as a minarchist. But the concept was that if you have let's play a thought exercise. This will make this more fun. How about this? Let's take someone out of the audience at random. What's your name, sir? Spencer? Okay, Spencer. If you walk past a homeless person on the street and that person is starving to death and they ask you for food, if you don't feed them, have you committed a crime? No. Have you initiated force? No. Okay. If you have a child and it's your child and you, through neglect, allow your child to starve to death, have you committed a crime? Yes. Have you initiated force? Law students always know it. We need more libertarian lawyers, damn it. Exactly, and therein lies the problem, because the anarcho-capitalists arguing for the non-aggression principle must therein deal with the concept of the implicit contract, which many of you probably understand, implicit contracts, right? If you have a child and it's your child, then you have an implicit contract with that child to take care of it, right? Not to allow it to starve to death. But allowing it to starve to death is not an initiation of force, as we just learned from Spencer. It is merely neglect. So that's why I part ways with the non-aggression principle, because plenty of anarcho-capitalists have said government is a greater evil than parents who would starve their children to death. Okay, yes, the governments do kill millions of people, but I still think that if you starve your child to death, it should be a crime punishable by jail. So I know famous anarcho-capitalists, again, Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell and others, and it is intrinsically a libertarian philosophy. The next type of libertarianism is one which can be associated with leftism as well. It's civil libertarianism. So if you're a civil libertarian, that means that you think that the government should not pass laws that restrict, oppress, or selectively fail to protect people in their day-to-day lives. Now, the best definition of this may be, you're all law students, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that a man's right to swing his fist ends where my nose begins. In the United States, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, represents the interest of civil libertarians, and a civil libertarian may or may not be a fiscal libertarian, right? So you may be someone who believes in civil rights or civil liberties, but you don't believe in economic liberties. And a couple of juxtaposed examples of this would be Martin Luther King, who was very much a civil libertarian, but who was not a fiscal libertarian, and Edward Snowden, who is very much a civil libertarian, but who is also a fiscal libertarian. And nowadays, the modern context of libertarianism, that's what people think of when they think of a libertarian. They think someone who is also fiscally conservative or fiscally libertarian, as well as civilly libertarian when it comes to civil rights. I don't like to call it fiscally conservative, because conservatives really aren't that fiscally conservative anymore. We should just call it fiscally libertarian. Classical liberalism. Classical liberals, you can find this being bandied about quite frequently these days. I just completed an interview with a gentleman by the name of Dave Rubin. Anybody here know the Rubin Report online? Fan of his on YouTube. He's a former liberal, used to work for the Young Turks, and then got run out on a rail because he didn't buy into their commie BS. Classical liberals, they agree with the Declaration of Independence that all people have basic human rights and that the sole legitimate function of government is to protect those rights. Most of the founding fathers and most of the European philosophers who influenced them, people like John Locke, were classical liberals. But however, classical liberals, and especially in modern contexts, can believe in a social safety net of some sorts. And some examples of that might be Gary Johnson. Or Friedrich Hayek, economist Friedrich Hayek, who did argue for some sort of a minimal social safety net. And yeah, so that would be a classical liberal. And within the classical liberal range on the political viewpoints, would be what I would consider myself, which if you take classical liberal to its next step towards anarchy, but if you get off the train before you get to anarchy, you have the school of thought known as minarchy, a minarchist. Minarchist was a term which was actually coined as a pejorative. It was meant to be a slight, because in the 1970s, a gentleman by the name of Robert Nozick wrote a book, which is a fantastic book you should all read. It's called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And in it, he described the ideal minimal state, which would not include social safety nets. So a minarchist could be a classical liberal, but it would be someone who wouldn't believe in social welfare programs. So that would be a minarchist. A minarchist would exist between classical liberalism and get off before you go all, privatize the fire departments and the anarchy. The next one, fiscal libertarians, also known as laissez-faire capitalists. And as we all know, the only fair is laissez-faire. They believe in free trade, low or non-existent taxes, and very minimal or non-existent corporate regulation. Most traditional Republicans are fiscal libertarians. Some examples of that would be Ted Cruz, Mike Lee, and Rand Paul, fiscal libertarians. And doesn't have anything to do with your social viewpoints, right? You can be completely socially liberal, or you can be completely socially conservative. And that's really one of the beautiful things about libertarianism, because one of the problems that we had during the Johnson presidential campaign was that I think he mischaracterized libertarianism, in that he described libertarian as socially liberal and fiscally conservative, which is just not true. Although I myself am a social liberal and a fiscal conservative, there are lots of Christian libertarians. And that what it really means to be a libertarian, in a sense, in a broad sense, is that you get to choose which values you have for your own life. You can choose your religion, or you can choose no religion. And that's, you can be a libertine, or you can be a Quaker. You can be a Amish or a Mennonite. And that's what it makes libertarianism very difficult to sell, because it's very difficult to define, because people look at Gary Johnson and they think this is libertarianism, but it's just not true. It encompasses a wide variety of viewpoints. Essentially, the thing that we agree on the most is that we don't take our values and use the government to force them on others. You know, you may choose to smoke, engage in dangerous behaviors, but as long as that doesn't impose a negative externality on others, then you could be a libertarian. I can say all day long whatever I think about religion, but it doesn't matter, because you wouldn't use I wouldn't use the government to enforce that belief, right? And alternatively, Ron Paul, who is very Christian, very, very devout Christian, doesn't use his religion as a means to force his own principles on others, right? We have libertines, we have transgender, polyamorous, genderqueer, LGBTQ, everything under the sun in the Libertarian Party. We had a fat, naked, dancing guy, and we had a transgender wearing a raincoat, a see-through raincoat on stage at the Libertarian Party. But the difference between the liberal LGBT activist and the libertarian LGBT activist is that the libertarian LGBT activist isn't going to use the government to force you to create a separate bathroom, right? So it's a difficult subject, but the libertarianism boiled down to those concepts is what has created such a broad movement in the United States. Now, this is a school of libertarian thought that a lot of people don't know about. It's not very widely publicized. It's not very talked about. It's not very popular, but it is one that is a sincere school of thought. Some of you might have heard of Max Stirner. Sometimes can be someone who is associated with the school of geo-libertarianism. Geo-libertarianism, they're often called one-taxers, and what that means are that fiscal libertarians, that they essentially believe that land can never be owned, and that they would want to abolish income taxes, sales taxes, in favor of one single land rental tax, which could be used to support collective interests such as the military or defense or whatever, and that how that's spent would be determined through democratic processes. Thomas Paine was an example of someone who was a one-taxer or a geo-libertarian. I mean, it's the argument that they make, and again, this is not a defense of that argument, this is just an explanation of it, The argument that the geo-libertarians make simply is that land is one of the only resources that if you control land, you can deny others the use of it. Right? So in the economy, most of economics is not a zero-sum game. If I buy an Xbox, you can have an Xbox. Right? If I eat a Fatty's pizza, you can have a Fatty's pizza. But land is one of the only things that if I own it, I can deny you the use of it, and it can impose a cost on the community according to the geo-libertarians. So their argument is, let's get rid of all of these other taxes and let's just have one simple land rental tax, which we already have. We have a property tax right now. So what geo-libertarians would say is, get rid of all the other taxes, just pay your property taxes, and that would be the only tax that we would have. Not a very widely publicized, and certainly not popular at all in libertarian circles where no tax is a good tax. Now, another very unpopular school of libertarianism, but one which I feel I must bring up, is called libertarian socialism. And now I just lost my entire fan base. But libertarian socialism would agree with anarcho-capitalists that government is a monopoly and it should be abolished. But they essentially believe that nations should be ruled instead by what we call work-share cooperatives and labor unions instead of corporations. And probably the most famous example of this would be Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky considers himself a libertarian socialist. The only problem is that, Noam Chomsky is just Trotsky waiting for a Stalin to come along, right? So the problem with people like Chomsky and people like Trotsky is that they're philosophers, and eventually they're going to get an ice pick in the head when they take over, and a strong man like Lenin or Stalin comes along, because once they centralize power into the hands of the state to abolish the state, then they've given over power to a strong man, and we get the conditions for tyranny. So I reject the school of libertarian socialism, Noam Chomsky, hell no, and we go back to the concepts of true libertarianism, in my opinion, which is the concepts of decentralization, right? Localism. And this is actually why I think that liberals should be more attracted to libertarianism, especially because we're always talking about buying local, eating local, buying at your local farmer's market. I mean, libertarianism, in a sense, would require that in certain ways, because local problems would be solved through local governance. The more intimate, the more personal, the more difficult a question that is posed, the more local it should be solved. And that was essentially the main concept when the Founding Fathers initiated the Articles of Confederation here in the United States. And then, of course, we had too many years of sweet, sweet freedom, and we needed a bigger government, because that's what happens. Right. Jefferson, the natural tendency is for government to grow and for liberty to shrink. Neo-libertarianism, another school of thought which will lose my entire fan base just by mentioning. Neo-libertarians are fiscal libertarians who support a strong military and believe that the U.S. government should use that military to overthrow dangerous and oppressive regimes. It is their emphasis on military intervention that distinguishes them from paleo-libertarians, which we'll get into in a moment, and gives them a reason to make common cause with neo-conservatives. So this is a school of libertarians who want total domestic libertarianism, but it's sort of like Carthaginian Europe. They have libertarianish policies domestically, but overseas we're like Genghis Khan. The idea is that yes, we can have freedom here, but since other countries don't accept our concept of democracy and liberty and freedom, we're going to bring it to them by the barrel of a gun. Now, if you are to play devil's advocate and to be objective and not be, just a full of yourself, philosopher that everything you say is right, consider this. I could use the antebellum South, or I could use an example in South Africa, or let's see, what would be a better example? We're in Georgia. I'm not using the South. Okay. Consider yourself a slave of a regime. Consider yourself let's assume that Assad did use chemical weapons against his own people. You're not going to care if the United States followed constitutional processes and bombed the hell out of the Syrian regime and stopped them from engaging in chemical weapons, using chemical weapons against its own people, you're not going to care about that. Now, we as Americans, we do have to care about that because that's our tax dollars, and that's our money, and that's our blood and treasure being used to fight these wars in the Middle East. But if you look at libertarianism from a universalist concept, right, we don't get our liberties because we're Americans, and we certainly don't get them from government. We get our rights because we're individual humans, and all humans are endowed with the same rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How that's adjudicated, how that's handled through a system of law is another question entirely. But from a philosophical perspective, it doesn't matter if you're a Syrian refugee or a blowhard American libertarian presidential candidate. You as a human being have the exact same intrinsic individual rights. So the neo-libertarian is arguing that in a borderless world, in a world where we look at no one based on color, skin, creed, nationality whatsoever, hell yes, bomb Assad and save those kids, because those kids also have the exact same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, as a constitutional libertarian and as a minarchist, I have a problem with this because I think that often the problem is that we have unintended consequences that people like neoconservatives like John Bolton, people like George Bush, John McCain, and Lindsey Graham, they don't foresee or they don't care. They never, to them, they're a hammer and all the world's a nail. And so that's why I think we have so many problems with our foreign policy. But a neo-libertarian simply, they agree with anarcho-capitalists that we should live in a borderless world. And if we live in a if we push aside the concepts of borders, and we have this military, to them, let's play another thought experiment. It's like you have a gun, it was created by the U.S. military, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. You have a bullet in that gun, again, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. It's there. You can use it if you want, and you've got some Somali pirates who've kidnapped some friends of yours, and they're sailing around the Horn of Africa. Would you take the gun and shoot it and use it to save your friends? Yeah, but you just violated the non-aggression principle because you used stolen American taxpayers' money to fire a bullet without using constitutional due process and authority to save your friends. So essentially, neo-libertarians are operating on a grand scale of foreign policy in using those kinds of minuscule thought experiments. The problem is that when you start to expand those to international affairs, it can get quite messy. There are no famous neo-libertarians because they've all been driven into hiding and they dwell in just obscure Facebook groups. It's true. It's true. Even libertarians, like for the most part, they don't know what a neo-libertarian is. But if you come out as a neo-libertarian, they will violate your net. Libertarians will violate your net. They will. They will. There's no love for neo-libertarians in the neo-libertarian movement. Again, I'm not one. Okay, it's not an endorsement. It's just a definition. All right, objectivism, another controversial school of thought. The objectivist movement, founded by Russian-American novelist Ayn Rand, author of Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, who incorporated fiscal libertarianism into a broader philosophy emphasizing rugged individualism and what she called the virtue of selfishness. Ooh, now if you're a liberal and a social democrat, then your hackles are raised and you're ready to go to war. But if you've never been introduced to the concepts of the virtue of selfishness, I highly recommend you read it. Just because oftentimes we get an emotional response to words like that when we think of selfishness, because really I think Adam Smith put it much better when he said that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher that we get our daily meal, but out of self-interest. You see, capitalism isn't really a selfish philosophy because, yes, it is in some sense based on self-interest, but before I can serve my own self-interests, I have to serve your self-interests, right? The guys at Fatty Pizza today had to serve us before they could be served. So objectivism takes the concept of selfishness to its logical conclusion, and she also derides the concept of altruism. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was very much an objectivist before objectivism existed, right? He believed in the concept of hyper-individualism. Nothing more dangerous nowadays than to be a Nietzschean, a Randian, an objectivist, an individualist. Because, and this is this is Nietzsche's argument, but nowadays Christian virtues are the virtues of the United States. Those virtues are humility, servility, And Ayn Rand rejected, who was an atheist, rejected the Christian virtues of service for service's sake. And Nietzsche argued that, that we should, as individuals, should serve ourselves. But Christianity came along and instilled in us a sense of virtue which is opposed to selfishness in many ways, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, render unto Caesar. So in many ways, I was raised in a Christian church. I've read the Bible 6 times, and humility was a very important virtue that I was taught growing up in school. But this is not what Ayn Rand and Friedrich Nietzsche argued. They said, be proud of being a badass. Be proud of your own amazingness, right? What is one of the biggest things, the worst things that we call anyone? An arrogant douchebag, self-absorbed narcissist, which is amazing because in American culture nowadays we say, love yourself. You have to love yourself before you love others. But don't you dare love yourself in public. Don't you dare post that another selfie. Don't you dare, because you will be accused of being self-absorbed because you will be humble, or we will demand you be humble. We will destroy. In America, we destroy people who do not display appropriate humility. People want you to be humble more than they want you to be kind, simply because we all, I think in some ways it's hypocritical, because we all want to be proud of ourselves and to parade our victories in front of everyone. But nowadays, the American public definitely does, in some sense, demand humility. I think that's changing, especially because of our current commander-in-chief. There's nothing humble about that man. And no, not at all. But that's what people's problem is with him. That's what a lot of people don't like about Donald Trump. They see him as a self-absorbed, narcissistic egotist. Well, Ayn Rand probably would have loved him. Friedrich Nietzsche would have saw Donald Trump as the Übermensch. The danger in that philosophy is that taking it to its extremes, which any philosophy taken to its extremes will end up with a gulag. But the problem with taking that philosophy to its extreme is that, again, a strong man will be given power eventually. And that's really the danger when it comes to, I believe, taking objectivism or Nietzschean or Randian philosophy to its moral extremes. Ayn Rand, a famous example. Yaron Brook is another popular objectivist. There's a gentleman, actually I had lunch with him in LA a few weeks ago, who popped up on my radar. And you guys are in law school, you probably don't watch a lot of television. Supernatural, maybe you saw The Big Lebowski, he was a minor character in it. Gentleman by the name of Mark Pellegrino. Look him up. He's an objectivist actor in Hollywood who's starting a new party called the American Capitalist Party. Fascinating gentleman, and we frequently go back and forth on Twitter. So check him out. He's an interesting new face on the political scene. And finally, the final school of libertarianism, then we can go into questions, is paleo-libertarianism. And there's also paleo-conservatism, but paleo-libertarians, they differ from neo-libertarians in that they are isolationists, mostly. They're not entirely isolationist. Some of them are non-interventionists, for the Ron Paul fans in there. I don't want to offend. But they believe that the United States should not become entangled in international affairs. They tend to be suspicious of international coalitions such as the United Nations, liberal immigration policies, or libertarian immigration policies, you might call them, and other potential threats to cultural stability. So a paleo-libertarian is someone who is concerned about the stability of the culture. Some examples of this would be Ron Paul, people like Pat Buchanan and Murray Rothbard. Now, Ron Paul did not like to be called an isolationist because he was very much for free trade. And Murray Rothbard, who founded the school of anarcho-capitalism later in his life, began to flirt with what they called the paleo strategy and hung out with paleo-conservatives. They had a strategy, they called it the paleo strategy, and this is their words, not mine, but that they wanted to cater to racist rednecks as a means to grow the liberty movement, because they saw that the interests of libertarians and of paleo conservatives and paleo libertarians were aligned, and we did get in a lot of trouble for that during the presidential campaigns. But a paleo-libertarian is going to be someone who is concerned about the culture. They're going to be concerned about the borders. They're going to be concerned about letting them immigrants and Mexicans take the jobs that they don't want to do. I mean, I'm very much a libertarian when it comes to immigration. I think that I agree with the neo-libertarians in the sense that all humans deserve the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Constitutionally, the government has power over naturalization, but the Constitution doesn't say anything about immigration. We have, as you guys well know, we've had plenty of court cases that have affirmed the government does have power over immigration. But from a philosophical perspective, I would like to see something more like an Ellis Island protocol, which is, in my opinion, a better way of having immigration reform. But paleo-libertarians are concerned with the state of American culture. They do not want too many immigrants coming. Actually, Ron Paul was very much a hawk when it came to border positions. If you take a look at his policies when he ran for Congress, I mean, you probably can't get elected as a Republican unless you're Lindsey Graham or Marco Rubio in some ways. You probably can't get elected as a Republican, especially in Texas, without some sort of a firm border policy that is restrictionist and one that would be, build a wall. But a paleo-libertarian would be someone who they would generally have socially conservative values, although there are very few exceptions. So that is the 11 schools of libertarianism that I've identified for you all, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll be happy to take all your questions. Yes, sir.
What is your position on how utilities should be owned, specifically water and electricity?
Yeah, personally, I'm for full privatization of our utilities. I think they're a product like anything else. The question is how can they be deployed? How can they be denied? And what's the best mechanism for deploying them? Government, I believe that government is inherently inefficient. So the problem with utilities is that when you're in an emergency, something like Hurricane Katrina, the government is going to be less efficient at delivering those goods or services to the American people. Now, water is something that doesn't necessarily need to be delivered through pipes. Everybody's like, well, how are you going to get the pipes to it if you have all these competing water utilities and things like that? Well, I think Nestle delivers most of their water in this form. And lots of people can purchase water tanks. There are a lot of homes that actually don't have water pipes. If you live on hills, for example, in some of the areas of Missouri and probably here in Georgia, there are homes that aren't hooked up to water utilities that they truck in their water. But electricity, there's so many different angles to this. There's the question of rights, right? Do you have a right to water? Do you have a right to electricity? My answer to that from the philosophical perspective would be no on both counts. But when it comes to the efficiency question, the economic question, the pure objective question of whether or not those things can be provided in a superior fashion through the marketplace, I think unquestionably they can be better served. Now, the third question, the dangerous question, the dark, terrible, terrifying question, is the question of whether they can be denied. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it so that you cannot be denied specifically public but also private services on account of a laundry list of things, including ageism, for example. If you're over 40 years old, right, then you qualify, right? If you're a white male under 40 years old, you are not a protected class, but once you hit 40, good news, white guys, you're protected. 4 more years, guys, 4 more years for me. But in a world without a Civil Rights Act, could Muslims be denied an electric utility? Could blacks be denied an electric utility? Yes, but the problem is that you miss what the invisible hand does, and that's called creating a market opportunity, right? So what happens is when you have a vacuum, a void, that's where entrepreneurship comes into play. Most people don't like that because they're like, whoa, we got a vacuum here. The government has to do something immediately, and we've got to pass legislation, and we've got to solve the problem, and politicians are more than happy to exploit that. But when it comes to this question of utilities, you've got the rights question, and you've got the efficiency question. In my belief, from the efficiency question, is that the private market can deliver these better. And when it comes to the rights question, those would be positive rights. And you may have, as a child, maybe under the age of 18, you may have some positive rights. Some positive rights might be things like a right to a lawyer if you're accused of a criminal trial, perhaps. But for the most part, I think that government is not efficient at delivering these goods or services. So I do not believe that you have a right to water or or food or utilities because it comes at someone else's expense, essentially, right? So I can come up with a laundry list of other things like medical care, right? If you have a right to medical care, and I'm a doctor, and I'm the only doctor on the island, right, and I decide to take one day off and somebody needs a heart surgery, are you going to send the men in with the guns to come and take me off of my day of vacation to go save somebody's life? Because it's essentially what you're doing, is you're going into to the utilities at gunpoint, demanding that you have services. Healthcare, electricity, and water, right.
There's an infrastructure question that makes utilities completely separate.
Right. Well, I'm postulating because some people think healthcare is a right too, right? So I'm just spitballing when it comes to the concept of positive rights. Anything else? Yes, sir.
So how do you view, or what's your plan about taking libertarianism mainstream, I like to say? So you have the idea of people run as libertarians, the third parties, as you know, have done quite well in this country, and there are libertarian-ish things in the Republican Party, like Rand Paul. So what do you think, what do you see as the future of bringing these ideas to the mainstream?
Well, sort of like the free market economics in a sense. Do what you do best and trade for the rest. Like everybody's going to take a different approach. Some people are going to be doing things like starting libertarian law firms. If you guys have never heard of the Institute for Justice in Washington D.C., one of the best libertarian legal firms out there. And if any of you guys, you pass the bar and you become lawyers and you want to work for libertarian causes, the Institute for Justice is a perfect example of that. If you're interested in international relations or international law, places like the Atlas Institute can do a good job. But, politics is really just a lagging indicator to what's happening with the culture. I honestly think that probably one of the better pursuits that libertarians can engage in to take the ideas mainstream would actually be cultural pursuits. And those are the things that are, because they're not respectable activities generally. When it comes to the political class, they can be eschewed. People look down on them, but frequently culture is way out ahead of politicians, right? So there's a new band called Backwards, right? They're an anarcho-capitalist band, and they've got a new album out that is on the top of the Billboard charts, and they're bringing libertarian ideas to tens of thousands of people, and many more than many of our libertarian politicians are. So culture is one way. Making films, libertarian movies. I actually made my first feature film a couple years ago based on a science fiction book. I'd like to make more films as well, because when you can convince people of the ideas and the philosophy and the principles first, when you make people mostly behave on feelings, right? Not as much on logic, right? They're not going to sit down and read the white paper about why utilities may be superior if they're privatized or why government needs to be out of the healthcare system, right? But if they see a film about Cuban socialism and Cuban healthcare, right? If you had the anti-Michael Moore instead of doing Cuban documentaries about how amazing their healthcare system is, you actually go in and show them how crappy socialized medicine is, then you may start to change the culture. But for right now, Hollywood is very liberal. Very few Hollywood conservatives, and they get blacklisted when they come out as conservatives or libertarians in Hollywood. Vince Vaughn's a libertarian. There's a lot of them out there. Penn Jillette. You have to be so amazing that you can just sell out every crowd or whatever it is that your art is. Otherwise, if you need other people in Hollywood, you're in trouble. But I honestly think that culture is one of the better ways to do it. It's just not respectable, quote unquote. Right? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What are your views on how much the government should be involved in, say, women's health care and things like that? What about, decisions people make for themselves about what they do with their bodies and such?
That's a good question. I'm secular, but I consider myself pro-life. And I didn't come to that opinion because of any higher power, but through a logical deduction of the question of if the unborn child is a human being, and if all human beings deserve the same right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how that is adjudicated is a messy question. It's a difficult question, but I have to, for my own personal morality, state up front what I believe from a moral perspective, and that's what I believe. But from a legal perspective, it's much muddier. Earlier, I was talking about the concept of decentralization, right? Now, if I ended the war on drugs, such as I would, I'm telling you right there that I can't tell you what you can or can't put in your body. So drugs like Plan B or what's the name of the pill that you take that is an abortifacient, for example, right? If I can't outlaw that according to my philosophy, then those would be available. So essentially, one of the only tools I really have is my own sense of moral compass, which I would try and instill on you to tell you why I think that it would be better for you to, one, be personally responsible before we get into these kinds of problems, and then two, to explain why I think that adoption is a much better way to handle this, especially since my little sister is adopted and was almost aborted, and who I'm very happy to have now, and I have a beautiful nephew as well, her son. So from the moral and perspective, it's one question, but from the question of the law, I think that abortion should be handled at the state level. It should not be a federal issue. The reason why is because what I said earlier, which is that the more difficult and complex and intimate and personal question is, the more it should be handled in the communities. Now that might mean that some communities might outlaw abortion. And if you had a decentralized structure in the United States, a beautiful laboratory of democracy, if you want to go live in New York City or if you want to go live in Connecticut or places where those abortions would be legal, then you would have that option. But the problem is that nowadays everybody believes that everything is a right and it should be adjudicated federally, and the federal government must handle everything, which I think is a bit, it's opposed to the concept of the original American experiment. So the thing is, I can't make that decision for you. Gary Johnson, who I ran against, considers himself very much pro-choice. He does not argue for the rights of the unborn. But, however, he did sign a partial birth abortion ban in New Mexico while he was governor. So I think in some sense he was sort of saying one thing and doing another. I do believe in some sense that it is murder. However, because I'm not a scientist and because it's impossible for me to determine exactly when life begins, although I do think it is a life because it has separate DNA from the mother, which would make it a separate human, then we must find ways to protect life. How the government gets involved in that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, generally an individual basis, and it's not to say that I don't feel for the rights of the mother. I absolutely do, but I also feel for the rights of the child. Everybody who has an opinion about abortion is alive today. Any other questions?
I think we're actually out of time.
Oh man, sorry. Come tonight.
They have class at 1.
Oh, sorry.
But if you're willing to hang out for just a few minutes, if anybody else that we didn't get to has a question, they can come.
Yeah, just come up and chit chat.
Thank you guys for coming. Let's give Mr. Petersen a round of applause.
You guys are tough. Gonna be good lawyers.